There are few characters in Tolkien's Legendarium who capture the imagination quite like the Istari, the 5 wizards of Middle-earth. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to Tolkien Untangled's top 10 list of facts about the Heren Istarion, the Order of Wizards. Number 10. What are wizards? So, to answer this question, we need to go back to the very beginning of all things, to a time before even the creation of the universe. And, like every single story in Tolkien's Legendarium, if we go back far enough, we will find that the whole thing begins with Eru Ilúvatar, the One, the creator of all things, who dwells outside of creation in the timeless halls. The first thing that Ilúvatar does in the entire story is create the Ainur, the Holy Ones, the divine spirits that come into being as an offspring of Ilúvatar's thought. The mightiest of all these Ainur is Melkor, the future Dark Lord. The next 14 greatest are known as the Valar, and below them are the unnumbered multitudes of lesser Ainur known as Maya. And Maya are sort of like angels or demigods. Eventually, Ilúvatar brought all these Valar and Maya together, where he taught them the music of creation, and the Ainur sang the Ainu Lindale, which brought the universe of Ea into existence. Anyway, if we skip forward now, like literally tens of thousands of years, we will come to the awakening of the first ever elves. But, unfortunately for everyone, the first being ever to discover the newly awakened elves in Middle-earth was Melkor, the worst guy ever. To make a very long story short, the Valar and their faithful Maya then fought a war against Melkor known as the War for the Sake of the Elves, and in that war, Melkor was defeated and imprisoned. But turns out, when the Valar and the Maya go to war, they are so powerful that they absolutely devastate the land upon which they fight. After the war for the sake of the elves, all of the entire area around Melkor's first evil fortress is laid to waste. For the entire rest of Middle-earth's history, that part of the world is completely ruined. Now, if we skip forward again many more thousands of years, we will come to the War of Wrath, where once again the hosts of the Valar and Maya fight the forces of Melkor, who is now known as Morgoth. And although the Valar and their Maya do win this war, once again the entire part of the world in which they're fighting is destroyed. A vast area of land is drowned by the power of the Valar in this war, and towards the end of the Second Age, so many more thousands of years in the future, the Valar are once again put in a position of making war when the corrupted men of Númenor invade the Undying Lands. This time, the Valar don't fight back, and instead Ilúvatar breaks the world and changes its shape and drowns the entire island of Númenor beneath the waves. So, the first time that the Valar and their Maya involved themselves in a war against the Dark Lord, their victory came at the cost of destroying a vast area of Middle-earth. The second time they get involved, the exact same thing happens again. The third time, they choose not to fight, but Ilúvatar intervenes anyway, and once again, a massive area of land is destroyed. And the reason that all of this is relevant is because by the time that the Third Age rolls around and Sauron begins to rise again, the Valar have kind of learned their lesson. If they wanted to, they definitely could journey to Middle-earth and defeat Sauron with the full force of their divine power, but they'd probably wipe out most of Middle-earth and its free peoples in the process. But if they do nothing, Sauron would eventually dominate all of Middle-earth, and the free peoples would be entirely wiped out or enslaved. Considering that Sauron is a Maya himself, he is kind of the Valar's responsibility, and so Manwë, the king of the Valar, the king of all Arda, he summoned a council of the other most powerful Valar, and together, probably under the guidance of Ilúvatar himself, they came up with a compromise to amend the errors of old, a way to aid the Free Peoples in their resistance against Sauron without unleashing the full extent of their power and, destroying everything. This compromise was the Istari, the 5 wizards. And knowing this backstory is crucial in understanding not only the purpose of the 5 wizards, but also their powers. Or perhaps I should say lack of powers, because the wizards of Tolkien's Legendarium are very different from the sorcerers or magicians or conjurers of cheap tricks that we see in other fantasy stories. The origin of the word wizard is simply a wise person, wise-ard, in the same way that a drunkard is a drunk person. And wisdom is the power that the wizards bear. They are not warriors, they are not kings, they are not sorcerers, they are guides, they are helpers, they are teachers whose duty is to aid the Free Peoples and instruct them in their wars against Sauron. But they are not to challenge Sauron themselves. And the humility of the Istari's purpose is reflected in the physical and spiritual limits that are placed upon them by the Valar who sent them. You see, before they arrived in Middle-earth, the 5 wizards were 5 Maiar. They were 5 of those that were created by Ilúvatar himself way back in the Timeless Halls. They were 5 of the beings who sang the universe into existence. They were probably among the Maiar who fought in the War for the Sake of the Elves and the War of Wrath. But when they come to Middle-earth, they are Maiar no longer. Well, I guess actually that's probably more of a philosophical question than it is a question of lore, but I would argue that when the 5 wizards arrive in Middle-earth, Maiar is no longer the right word to describe them. All 5 are bound permanently in bodies as of men, subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain. Their powers are massively limited, and we're told that upon arriving in Middle-earth, the wizards had need to learn much anew by slow experience, and their memories of life before Middle-earth felt only like a vision from afar. So, the 5 wizards are bound in a massively limited non-Maiar body. Their Maiar powers are massively limited too, and their Maiar memories are massively limited. Sauron is a Maiar, the Balrog is a Maiar, but Gandalf, no, not anymore. Gandalf and the other 4 are all Istari, and Istari is a Quenya word meaning those who know. Number 9. The origins of the 5. So, I've just talked about what the wizards are and why they came to Middle-earth. Now let's focus on who they are and how they got there. As I just mentioned, it was Manwë who summoned the Valar to a council in Valinor, in which the decision was made to aid the enemies of Sauron by sending Maiar emissaries to wield wisdom instead of might and help the Free Peoples clothed in their forms. But, interestingly, in the beginning, the number of Maiar emissaries was intended to be 3, and each one of them was chosen by one of the Valar whom they served. It's not uncommon for Maiar to serve a particular like-minded Valar. For example, Ossë, the Maiar of storms and coastal waters, served Ulmo, the Valar of all waters. But I think there's a lot to be said about all 3 of the Maiar by looking at the Valar who chose them for their task. The first Maiar to be chosen was a pupil of Aulës, the Valar of crafting, and this Maiar's name was Curumo. Now, what's interesting here is that alongside Curumo, we are told of only one other pupil of Aulës, and he was also a Maiar of creation known back in the day as Mairon, the Admirable. However, Mairon was eventually corrupted by Melkor, and for the rest of all time, he became known as Sauron. And the reason that this is significant is because when Curumo journeys to Middle-earth and becomes the first of the Istari to arrive, he becomes known to the elves as Curunir, which means man of skill or man of cunning devices. And a mannish translation of the elvish name Curunir is Saruman. So isn't that kind of crazy? Aule, the craftsman of the Valar, was a teacher to 2 Maiar, and those 2 Maiar went on to become Sauron and Saruman. Aule has a terrible taste in Maiar. Actually, I think the point that Tolkien was probably trying to go for has more to do with the idea that there's something inherently corruptive about being a craftsman, and how creation and destruction are one and the same, and how knowledge of industry can be dangerous, etc. Anyway, the second Maiar to be chosen at this council is a guy called Alatar. And Alatar was a pupil of Oromais, the hunter of the Valar. But the truth is, we know next to nothing about Alatar or who he turned into, except that he was destined to be the first of the incredibly mysterious blue wizards, who journey off into the south and the east and never again show up in any of the histories of the West. Now, I'll talk a lot more about the blue wizards a little later down this list, but the fact that Alatar was a pupil of Oromais is not insignificant. Oromais was the Valar who journeyed the most in Middle-earth. While most of the rest of the Valar were hanging out in the uttermost west, Oromais would ride through the empty lands of Middle-earth, hunting the monsters of Melkors. And it was during one of his great rides that Oromais chanced upon the first group of elves, right in the far east. So I think it's very cool that Alatar, the blue wizard of the east who studied under Oromais, may also have been a great traveller of the east and a hunter of evil things who befriended men and elves on his journeys. Also, in later writings, we learn that Alatar's name when he arrived in Middle-earth was probably Morinatar, which means Darkness Slayer. And so this only reinforces the idea that Alatar the Blue was a hunting wizard who journeyed south and east to slay the creatures of darkness. Now, the final one of these original 3 Maiar was chosen by Manwë himself, but we are told that he was a pupil of Manwë's wife, Varda, or Elbereth Githorniel as the elves call her, the Queen of Light. And he was also a counsellor of Irimo, that's the Valar of sleep and dreams and visions, and perhaps most importantly, he was also a pupil of Niennes, the Lady of Grief and Sorrow and Kindness and Pity. And pity is crucial in understanding why this Maiar was chosen. So his name is Olorine, but when Manwë chose him, he did not step forward with the other 2. For we are told that unlike Curumo and Alatar, Olorine feared Sauron, and he declared to Manwë that he was too weak for such a task. However, Manwë decided that this was all the more reason why he should go, and he perceived that this Maiar had the perfect degree of humility and wisdom to fulfill the appointed task. And as I'm sure you've all deduced, this Maiar became known as Gandalf. But you may very well be wondering, what about Radagast and the 5th wizard? Well, after Curumo, Alatar and Olorine were chosen by their respective Valar, 2 more names were put forward to bump the number up to 5. First was a Maiar called Iowendil, which means lover of birds, and he would go on to be known in Middle-earth as Radagast the Brown. Now, honestly, when I was making this list, I originally had a whole entry all about Radagast, but the more I talked about him, the more I wanted to keep talking about him, and in the end, that Radagast segment ended up being far too long to include in a video that's already pretty long. So what I'll do is save Radagast for now, and then next week I will release a whole video focusing exclusively on him. Anyway, the final wizard to talk about is the other blue wizard, wizard number 5. He accompanied Alatar as a friend, and his name was Parlando. Now, Parlando is every bit as mysterious as Alatar, But we are told that Tolkien had 3 different Valar in mind while figuring out which one Palando was most associated with. His final choice was that Palando was a people of Oromais, just like Alatar was. But among the names that Tolkien crossed out are Nienna and Mandos, the Lady of Pity and the Lord of Fate and Doom and Judgment, the Keeper of the Dead. And Mandos, along with his brother Iramo, the Dream Guy, they are known as the Feanturi, the Masters of Spirits, and Nienna is their sister. So, although it shouldn't really be considered canon, it is cool to consider that in his earliest stages, Tolkien may have intended for Palando to be a wizard with much more of an emphasis on spirit rather than the physical world. Number 8. The Blue Wizards and Glorfindel? In his 1954 essay on the Istari, which is published in the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien explicitly wrote that the Istari belonged solely to the Third Age, and all 5 of them arrived around the 1000th year of that age, so they're only about 2018 years old during the events of The Lord of the Rings. That's younger than Arwen, and she is the youngest named elf in that story. However, in a collection of notes that were written decades later, in the final year of Tolkien's life, we are told that this may no longer be the case. According to those last writings, the 2 blue wizards arrived thousands and thousands and thousands of years before the other 3, and when they arrived, they came in the company of the fan-favourite elf, Glorfindel. So, 4,859 years before The Lord of the Rings, back when the Second Age was just kind of getting going, Sauron completed his Tower of Barad-dûr, and he forged the One Ring. And according to Tolkien's last writings, this was the year in which the Blue Wizards first arrived in Middle-earth. They became known to the Sindarin-speaking elves as the Ithrin Luin, which literally just means the Blue Wizards, but they didn't actually spend very much time with the elves at all. They journeyed off into the east and the south, and after they did, they were never seen or heard from again by any of the peoples west of Mordor. However, I find these later writings so interesting because they fundamentally change the way that I imagine the wizards of Middle-earth. Instead of being an order of 5, it seems Tolkien later intended for there to be 2 separate eras of wizards, the Age of the 2 and the Age of the 3. The 2 blue wizards came to aid the free peoples in the Second Age, and so I guess they were kind of like proto-Istari. They were the original wizards who laid the groundwork for the later 3. They are a kind of an older branch of wizards who came much, much earlier than the famous wizards that we're all familiar with from The Lord of the Rings. And I find it especially interesting that these blue wizards are so intimately associated with Glorfindel. Back in the First Age, Glorfindel was a great elf of Gondolin, and he played a very important role in the story of that hidden elven city. But before the First Age ended, Glorfindel was killed. He fell in battle with a Balrog. His body was rescued by an eagle and then buried beneath a cairn of stones. However, in the Second Age, Glorfindel was sent back to Middle-earth, and when he returned from death, he returned with far more power than he ever had during his first life. Just like all elves who died in Middle-earth, Glorfindel's spirit was held and judged in the halls of Mandos in the uttermost west, but before too long he was rehoused into a new body. And this isn't that special, to be honest. Lots of the most heroic elves of the First Age were eventually released to live again in Valinor, but Glorfindel is an exceptional case. We are told that during his second life in Valinor, Glorfindel was considered a peer of the Maiar, despite only being an elf, and he eventually became a follower of the Maiar spirit, Olorine. the guy who would one day become Gandalf. And this comparison with Gandalf is, I think, a hugely significant detail in understanding Glorfindel after his death. Because, as I say, during the Second Age, Glorfindel was sent back to Middle-earth with the two blue wizards, and when he returned, he wielded far more power than he had ever had before. Just like the wizards, Glorfindel came to Middle-earth with a hint of Maiar powers. We are told that to the Maiar, Glorfindel had now become almost an equal, for his spiritual power had been greatly enhanced by his self-sacrifice. And this makes Glorfindel absolutely unique among elves. There are only 2 elves in the entire Legendarium who die in Middle-earth and then return to Middle-earth for a second life there, but the other one, Luthien, is very different from Glorfindel. In Luthien's original life, she was a super powerful elven being with additional power inherited from her Maiar mother. But in her second life, Luthien was a mortal, stripped of the power that she once wielded. Glorfindel, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. He wielded more power in his second life, and there is only one other character in the entire Legendarium with that sort of claim to fame, Gandalf the White. I find it fascinating that Glorfindel fell fighting a Balrog, and although he eventually killed the Balrog, he died in the process. His body was then rescued by an eagle, and he later returned to Middle-earth with a power upgrade alongside 2 wizards. That is eerily similar to what happens to Gandalf. In Gandalf's case, he came with the 2 wizards before he died, and his body was rescued by an eagle after he returned to life, but other than that, Gandalf is basically Glorfindel 2.0, or perhaps Glorfindel is like a proto-Gandalf the White. It's very easy to gloss over, but in many ways I think Glorfindel of the Second and Third Ages might have more in common with the Istari than he does with the other elves. He's wise just like the wizards, he's almost an equal to the Maiar just like the wizards, and he comes to Middle-earth with a purpose, just like the wizards. Number 7. Gandalf and Círdan. So, while we're on the topic of super elves who rubbed shoulders with wizards, let's talk about Círdan the Shipwright, the first being in Middle-earth ever to encounter a wizard. When Saruman, Radagast, and Gandalf first arrived in Middle-earth, they were borne over the sea on a ship sent from the uttermost west. And this ship landed at the Grey Havens, the elven port that is governed by Círdan. And along with Elrond and Galadriel, Círdan was the only being in Middle-earth who truly knew what the wizards were and where they'd come from. The first wizard to arrive had a fair voice, raven hair, a proud bearing, and he wore robes of white. Círdan welcomed him, and that wizard went on to be known as Saruman. Then came Radagast, and potentially the Blue Wizards, depending on which version you go with, and lastly came the Grey Wizard, who seemed the least, less tall than the others and in looks more aged, leaning on a staff. But because Círdan is the most awesome dude ever, and he's among the wisest and most foresighted elves ever to live, and also he is the oldest, Círdan divines that this 5th wizard, the most humble of them all, actually has the greatest spirit. Círdan welcomes Gandalf with reverence, and he even removes the elven ring from his finger and gives it freely to the Grey Wizard. And that's why Gandalf ends up bearing Narya, the Ring of Fire, throughout the rest of the Third Age. It was a gift from Círdan, who perceived that Gandalf would both need it, but he was also worthy to bear it. Which is a particularly fascinating detail when we consider that Gandalf was the final wizard to arrive. First, Círdan met Saruman, and then didn't give him his ring of power. Then he met Radagast and the blue wizards, and he didn't give them his ring. But then he met Gandalf, and immediately he did. I think that giving a ring of power to Gandalf is one of the most important things that Círdan does in the Third Age, and I think that being given a ring by Círdan is one of the most important things that happens to Gandalf. Of all the wizards, Gandalf is the one who is instantly perceived to be the wisest and the most trustworthy by the wisest and most trustworthy elf in Middle-earth. Gandalf starts off with such a glowing recommendation. But there is a bit of a sting in this part of the story, because we're told that after Gandalf acquired his ring of power, Saruman became aware of Círdan's gift, and he begrudged it. He resented that Gandalf had been chosen over him, and Tolkien tells us this was the beginning of the hidden ill will that he bore to the Grey. And this segues us perfectly to number 6, the dark side of Saruman. So Saruman is a character that I find as fascinating as he is deplorable. We all know that during the events of The Lord of the Rings, he turns hardcore down the road into villainy, and over the course of that story, he goes from the chief of the Istari to a hateful beggar, a spiteful polluter of the Shire. But by taking a look at who Saruman was before The Lord of the Rings, we get some great little clues about what makes this character tick. Because I've heard it said that Saruman was once a great and noble wizard, but towards the end of his time in Middle-earth he was corrupted by Sauron's presence in the Palantir, and he turned from like a noble good guy into a tragic villain. But honestly, I don't think that's the case. I think there was something very dodgy about Saruman pretty much from day one. I've already explained how Círdan chose not to give Saruman his ring of power, but it seems that even in the beginning, Saruman is obsessed with rings. We're told that the lore of the Elven Rings is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. And don't forget, back when Saruman was the Maiar Kuramo, he studied crafting under the same Valar that Sauron once studied under. And the first thing that we're told Saruman did in Middle-earth was to follow the lead of the Blue Wizards and journey off into the east, where no tales tell of what he did there. Although what we do know is that he spent an incredibly long time in the east. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, Saruman was about 2019 years old, but he'd only been living in Isengard and interacting with the men of Gondor and Rohan for about 550 years. So for almost 75% of his entire time in Middle-earth, Saruman was way in the east, doing his own thing that we know next to nothing about. Except that in the foreword of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote that Saruman at some point journeyed into Mordor, and there he found the missing links in his own research into ring lore. When we are introduced to Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, he is bearing a ring of his own. So, way before Saruman came to Orthanc and inherited a Palantir, he was already very familiar with both Mordor and Sauron's art of ring forging. I would speculate that Saruman's intentions of claiming the One Ring and using it to become the new Master of Middle-earth began a lot earlier than he let on. And my suspicions of Saruman are supported by the fact that after The Lord of the Rings, once Aragorn's been crowned king, he and Gimli come to the now abandoned Tower of Orthanc, and there Gimli uses his dwarven insight to discover a hidden room where Saruman kept a number of ill-gotten treasures. In that room, Aragorn and Gimli find an ancient crown of the Dunedain called the Elendilmere, and a silver chain locked away in a casket. Now, what's super interesting about this is that the last time the Elendilmir showed up in Middle-earth's history was 3,000 years before The Lord of the Rings, when it was worn by Isildur in the battle in which he was slain, and the One Ring was lost in the Anduin River. And of course, before Isildur put the One Ring onto his finger, he kept it on a silver chain. So this discovery is startling. We are told that these things could not have been found unless they had been upon Isildur's body when he sank. Why then, though an age had passed, were there no traces of his bones? Had Saruman found them and burned them with dishonor in one of his furnaces? If that were so, it was a shameful deed, but not his worst. And I find this passage to be such an insight into Saruman's character, because it implies that he has been searching for the One Ring for a very long time. And although his descent into villainy isn't revealed until The Lord of the Rings, I feel that Saruman has been a bad guy for much longer than that. He may have feigned friendship with the White Council, but in secret he has been working towards the achievement of his own ends from the moment he returned from the East, if not before. However, it is very important to point out that although Saruman is a major villain of The Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien's books he is not a puppet of Sauron's. He is an entirely separate third party. He is an enemy to both the Free Peoples and the Dark Lord. In The Hunt for the Ring, we are given a great little story about Saruman's double treachery right at the beginning of the story. And I should note that there are a few different versions of this story, but one of them goes like this. So just before Frodo set out from Bag End with the ring on his quest to Mordor, the Black Riders hunted all across Middle-earth for the Shire and the Baggins that they were seeking. And in every version of this story, they come to Isengard to interrogate Saruman. But Saruman lies to the Nazgul. He denies any knowledge of the Shire or its whereabouts. But then the Nazgul encounter Grima Wormtongue on the road, or in some versions it's a half-orc from Dunland. But either way, the servant of Saruman's is then also interrogated by the Nazgul, but he is so intimidated by them that he reveals the truth that Saruman's been trading in pipeweed from the Shire for years. And so Saruman's treachery is revealed to the servants of Sauron. And all of this is happening at the same time that Gandalf is imprisoned in Orthanc. In one version of the story, when Saruman becomes aware that the Nazgul are now aware that he lied to them, Saruman, in fear and despair and perceiving the full horror of service to Mordor, resolved suddenly to yield to Gandalf and to beg for his pardon and help. Then Saruman hastened to the summit of Orthanc and found Gandalf gone. Away south against the setting moon, he saw a great eagle flying towards Edoras. So, isn't that awesome? In Tolkien's Unfinished Tales, he tells us that right at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, Saruman considered repenting to Gandalf and trying to make peace with him. But he was too late. His intention had always been to deceive both the Free Peoples and the servants of Sauron into believing that he was loyal to them alone, but in reality, he just ended up revealing himself to be a traitor to both the good guys and the bad guys. With Gandalf gone and all hope of redemption flown away with him, Saruman has no choice but to do everything in his power to ensure that he gets the One Ring first. It is the only way to avoid the consequences of his double betrayal. Number 5. The Wizard of Fangorn Forest. So, during the Riders of Rohan chapter in the Two Towers, after Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli have met Eomer and found the burned carcasses of the Uruk-hai that they've been hunting, they rest near the eaves of Fangorn Forest. And there, during the night, they see an old bent man, leaning on a staff and wrapped in a great cloak. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled down over his eyes. Aragorn approaches the man and speaks to him kindly and invites him to share their fire, but then the old man disappears into the forest, and the chapter ends on a note of mystery regarding exactly who this old man was. But considering that the very next chapter in which we see Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli is the White Rider chapter, where they encounter Gandalf the White inside the forest of Fangorn, it would seem a very fair assumption that this cloaked old man with a wide-brimmed hat and holding a staff is in fact Gandalf, and he's kind of watching his friends before officially revealing himself to them in their next chapter. However, this assumption is later refuted by Gandalf himself. After the three hunters are reunited with Gandalf, Gimli explicitly asks if the old man they saw last night was him, and Gandalf replies, "You certainly did not see me. Therefore, I guess that you saw Saruman. Evidently, we look so much alike that your desire to make an incurable dent in my hat must be excused." So, was it Saruman that the three hunters saw? Was he spying on them? Well, there's plenty more evidence in the text to suggest that the answer is yes. Éomer tells us that Saruman walks here and there, they say, as an old man, hooded and cloaked. And Gandalf later tells us that Saruman was so eager to lay his hands on his prey that he could not wait at home, and he came forth to meet and to spy on his messengers. But although this may seem fairly conclusive, there is still a little bit more to this mystery than a definite yes or no. Aragorn himself mentions the strange fact that the figure they saw was wearing a hat instead of a hood, and although this is fairly circumstantial evidence, Saruman is never ever described as wearing a hat, whereas Gandalf makes reference to his own hat in the very conversation where Gimli asks who it was that they saw. And the Saruman theory is made even more questionable if we look at a map and explore where exactly all of this is taking place. Tolkien tells us that the Uruk-hai carried Merry and Pippin from Amon Hen, where they killed Boromir, all the way to the point where the Entwash River exited Fangorn Forest, and then they were slaughtered just short of this forest, somewhere around here. And Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli made the same journey, sprinting on foot and arriving on the eaves of Fangorn to see this mysterious old man 4 days after leaving Amon Hen. So it took 4 days to travel this distance, except that Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli are moving incredibly quickly. Their chase is counted a marvel among the three kindreds of elves, dwarves and men, and when Éomer hears about their remarkable swiftness, he names Aragorn Wingfoot. So I feel like it would definitely take a regular person a lot longer than 4 days to make this same journey, and yet the distance between Amon Hen and the eaves of Fangorn isn't a huge amount further than the distance between the eaves of Fangorn and Isengard. These places are not close to each other, and we know that the three hunters encountered this mysterious old man on the night of February the 30th. The night before Aragorn's 88th birthday. And yes, in Tolkien's calendar, every month has 30 days, even February. But Isengard is attacked by the Ents only 2 nights later, and we know that Saruman was present in Isengard when the Ents attacked. So how could Saruman, who is limited in the body of an old man subject to the pains and weariness of earth, be able to travel from Fangorn to Isengard in under 2 days? We know he has no powers of super speed, as he is within a step or two of being caught and strangled when Isengard falls, and so I just don't think it's particularly plausible that Saruman could, or even would, make this journey so speedily. However, there is another theory that's put forward by Gimli, and this does make a lot of sense, and it opens up some very cool avenues of speculation regarding Saruman's magical abilities. Gimli says, "It was an evil phantom of Saruman that we saw last night, I'm sure of it." Now, this is Gimli theorizing, it's not Tolkien stating fact, but Gimli goes on to point out that the old man they saw left no boot prints on the ground, so maybe it was a phantom. Although Saruman's phantoms are never mentioned again, and so if this is what the hunter saw, then it's a very mysterious part of Saruman's powers. However, there is of course one other possibility for the identity of this old man. Perhaps he was neither Saruman nor Gandalf. There is a third wizard to feature in The Lord of the Rings, and we know that he does like hanging out in forests. So is it possible that the three hunters caught a glimpse of Radagast? Well, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that it was him, and I don't believe that Tolkien actually intended for this old man to be Radagast, but Radagast's actions and movements in the later War of the Ring are completely unknown, so there is no way to confirm that it wasn't him. Anyway, just before I move on from the Old Man of Fangorn, I will point out that Christopher Tolkien himself also speculated on who his father might have intended for this mysterious character to be. He provides no answers, but he suggests that perhaps the figure was either a wraith or vision of Saruman's, but he also speculates that maybe the vision of Saruman's was perhaps unwittingly created by Gandalf, who we are told was spending his time looking into Saruman's unhappy mind and seeing his doubt and fear. Perhaps, whilst concentrating on Saruman's thoughts, Gandalf somehow projected an image of him for Aragorn and the others to see. But the truth is, Christopher ended his speculations with this: I have found no other evidence to cast light on this most curious element in the tale. Number 4. The Blue Wizards were traitors. So, although we know very little about the Blue Wizards, in his 1954 essay on the Istari, Professor Tolkien hinted that just like Saruman, the Blue Wizards may very well have turned to the dark side. He tells us that the Blue Wizards passed into the east with Saruman, but unlike him, they never returned. And we're given 3 possibilities of what they did there. 1, perhaps they pursued the purposes for which they were sent. 2, perhaps they perished. Or 3, perhaps, as some hold, they were ensnared by Sauron and became his servants, forgetting the good in search for power to effect it. And this is a very cool but kind of dark topic to speculate on. If the Blue Wizards fell into corruption and became servants of Sauron's, then the quality of life for men in the East must have been abysmal. Imagine living in a land that's dominated by Sauron and ruled by 2 evil wizards who serve him. At least Saruman had the decency to betray everyone instead of just serving the Dark Lord. But anyway, 4 years after Tolkien wrote this, he wrote a letter in which he expanded a little bit more on the potential dark side of the Blue Wizards. He wrote, I really do not know anything clearly about the other 2. I think they went as emissaries to distant regions, missionaries to enemy-occupied lands, as it were. What success they had, I do not know, but I fear that they failed, as Saruman did, and I expect they were founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. And this strikes me as even worse. Were there dark magical cults in the East that were instigated and overseen by the corrupted Blue Wizards even after Sauron's defeat? It makes me think a little bit of the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings, who left their home to bring about the downfall of Sauron, but even after his fall, they then had to return home to deal with Saruman. Maybe there were a group of men in the East who went off on some unknown task that contributed to Sauron's defeat, but after the destruction of his ring, they also had to return to their homes to rid it of the secret cults founded by the treacherous Blue Wizards. However, maybe not. Number 3. The Blue Wizards were heroes. So even though I know I just said that in his 1954 writings Tolkien stated the Blue Wizards failed in their mission and succumbed to the corruption of Sauron, in the last year of his life Tolkien changed his mind, and he gave the Blue Wizards a much more optimistic role in the story. In these last writings, Tolkien gave the Blue Wizards new names and a new fate. Instead of Alatar and Palando, they were known in Middle-earth as Morinatar, which means Darkness Slayer, and Romestamo, which means Helper of the East. And in these final writings, the Blue Wizards not only stay true to their task and arrive in Middle-earth much earlier than the other three wizards, but they also contribute a huge amount of good to Middle-earth, and they play a key behind-the-scenes role in preventing Sauron's ultimate victory. We are told that their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. Not unlike Gandalf did in the Northwest, it seems that Morinatar and Romestamo spread wisdom and counsel among the peoples of the East, uniting the men who resisted Sauron and aiding them in their rebellions against the Dark Lord, exactly as they were supposed to. And Tolkien tells us that it worked. Morinatar and Romestamo must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who would, both in the Second Age and Third Age, otherwise have outnumbered the West. So think about that for a moment. There are so many wars between Sauron and the Free Peoples over the span of the Second and Third Ages, and in pretty much all of them, he recruits men from the East and the South into his armies, but not once are they mighty enough to completely overwhelm all of Middle-earth. They come very, very close multiple times, but they never succeed. Perhaps that is because of Morinatar and Romestamo throwing a spanner in the works of all of Sauron's plans in the East. If not for the Blue Wizards, perhaps the last alliance would have failed at the end of the Second Age, or perhaps one of Gondor's many, many, many wars with the Easterlings would have ultimately destroyed the Dunedain kingdom, if not for the efforts of our lesser-known wizards, working quietly in the background. Number 2. The Wizards and the White Council. So, just like many of the things I've talked about on this list, the White Council is a very mysterious part of Middle-earth's Third Age lore, and it was almost certainly inspired by a similar White Council that existed in the pre-Wizard Second Age, and was presided over by High King Gil-galad. However, throughout the entire Third Age, there are only 4 known meetings of the White Council, and we are never given an explicit rundown of who its members are, although we can say with certainty that they include Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan the Shipwright, Saruman, and Gandalf. We can also speculate that probably Celeborn was also a member, and maybe Radagast or Glorfindel too, but Tolkien never explicitly says so. Anyway, the 2 members who are most important to the story of the White Council are the 2 wizards, Gandalf and Saruman. Just under 1,000 years before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf ventured into Dol Guldur, seeking to uncover the mystery of the necromancer who dwelt there. And when Gandalf came, Sauron fled. The time was not yet right for Sauron to reveal himself to his enemies, and this journey into Dol Guldur began the period that became known as the Watchful Peace. For 400 years, Sauron laid low in the east, and Middle-earth had a relative reprieve from violence. But then Sauron returned to Dol Guldur, and everything changed. 3 years after the Watchful Peace ended, Lady Galadriel summoned the first meeting of the White Council in the Third Age. And at this council, the Lords of the Eldar agreed that Gandalf should be made the leader of their council. But Gandalf refused. He preferred his independence, and unlike both Saruman and Radagast, Gandalf has no permanent abode. He doesn't live anywhere, he just sort of wanders the world. And so Gandalf decides that he is not the best guy for this job, and Saruman is chosen instead. But Tolkien tells us that Saruman resented Gandalf for being the first choice, and this becomes just one more grudge that Saruman holds against him. Anyway, nearly 400 years later, the White Council meets again in Rivendell, and this is the first time that they properly go out and do anything. At the second meeting, Gandalf urges the White Council to launch an attack on Dol Guldur, which he is certain Sauron has now returned to. And he's right, but Saruman overrules him. Saruman has already begun to desire the One Ring for himself, and so he convinces the council that there's no sense in attacking Sauron, as his ring has now surely been washed all the way down the Anduin and far out to sea. Now, I don't think Saruman actually believed this. We know he'd been scouring the Anduin for years, but he convinced the council not to move against Sauron in a bid to buy himself more time to let the ring reveal itself, which he didn't think would happen if Sauron was threatened. However, again, very interestingly, this second meeting of the White Council is the only one where Gandalf has nothing to say. While Saruman is busy deceiving the others, Gandalf sits alone in silence and he smokes his pipeweed. And there is a very cool detail here, because as Saruman is making his point about the ring, Gandalf blows rings of smoke into the air, and when he tries to close his hand around one of the rings, it vanishes. A possible indication that Gandalf perceives Saruman's desire to claim the One Ring. Anyway, it is another 90 years before the White Council meets again, and during this meeting, Saruman finally relents, and they all finally attack Dol Guldur, just as Gandalf suggested centuries ago. And this takes place in the same year as the events of The Hobbit. This is what Gandalf is off doing throughout a great deal of Bilbo's adventure. But Tolkien tells us very, very little about the actual details of this attack. All we know is that the White Council went, and due to the devices of Saruman, Sauron was expelled from Dol Guldur. He declared himself openly, and he returned to Mordor, where he would remain until the destruction of the One Ring 78 years later. And after this, we are only told of the White Council meeting on one other occasion, which was 12 years after their attack on Dol Guldur. Again, during this meeting, we are not told much, except that after it, Saruman returned to Isengard, and he began to isolate himself from the rest of the council. From this point on, Saruman was pretty exclusively working for himself and endeavouring to find the One Ring and to claim it for his own, before either Sauron or the White Council could get their hands on it. But little did Saruman know, the One Ring had already been found, and thanks to Gandalf it was sitting safely and secretly in the Shire, within the possession of Bilbo Baggins. Number 1. Gandalf for the win. Now, I talked a lot about Gandalf's contributions to the Third Age in one of my earliest lore videos that I ever made on this channel, but what I will say right now is that pretty much every major event in the War of the Ring is in some way influenced by Gandalf. Either directly or indirectly, Gandalf is behind more or less everything. Obviously, we all know that it was Gandalf who set Bilbo off on the adventure in which the One Ring was found, and it was Gandalf who sent Frodo off on the quest to destroy it, but it was also Gandalf who insisted that Sam accompany him, and it was Gandalf who instructed Aragorn to keep his eyes open for a group of hobbits coming to Bree. And Gandalf also has some much more indirect contributions to the forming of the Fellowship. The only reason that Legolas is in Rivendell during the Council of Elrond is because he journeyed there to tell the wise that Gollum had escaped the Wood Elves' captivity in Mirkwood. And the only reason Gollum was in Mirkwood in the first place is down to Gandalf. Similarly, the reason that Gimli is present for the Council of Elrond is because he accompanied his father Glóin to tell the wise that a messenger from Mordor had come to Erebor looking for information about a hobbit called Baggins, but the only reason Glóin ever met a hobbit called Baggins is because of Gandalf. Gandalf is the reason that Thorin and his company of dwarves go on their quest to reclaim Erebor. He gives Thorin the map and the key, and he convinces Thorin that they need Bilbo Baggins as their burglar. Gandalf saves the dwarves from the trolls, he saves them from the orcs of Goblin Town, and although it is the eagles who save the dwarves from the wolves of Rhovanion, the reason that the Great Eagle is able to do this is because Gandalf befriended him after saving his life from a poisoned arrow years earlier. Within the same month, Gandalf's actions result in the expulsion of Sauron from Dol Guldur and the death of Smaug up in the north. After the events of The Hobbit, Gandalf befriended Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, and it was due to Gandalf's influence that Aragorn began to take an interest in the Shire. Not long after that, Gandalf journeyed to Minas Tirith, where he became a mentor and a friend and a great teacher to the steward's youngest son, Faramir. He taught Faramir wisdom that would go on to be used when Faramir decided to let Frodo and the ring go instead of taking it to his father. It was Gandalf who figured out the entire series of events that took the ring from Isildur's possession at the end of the Second Age all the way to Bilbo's at the end of the Third Age. It was Gandalf who figured out the importance of Gollum, Gandalf who sent Aragorn to hunt him down, and Gandalf who interrogated Gollum in Mirkwood. This revelation is what prompted Gandalf to send Frodo off on his quest. During that quest, Gandalf fought off the Nazgul on Weathertop 3 nights before Frodo was stabbed there. And along with Elrond, Gandalf summons the flood at the fords of Bruinen, and it's him who causes the waters to take the shape of white horses. After his fall in Moria, Gandalf spent 10 days battling the Balrog, and after his return as Gandalf the White, he helped Frodo from afar when Frodo put on the ring at Amon Hen. He healed Theoden and saved Rohan from the treachery of Isengard. He then prevented the Witch King from passing the gate of Minas Tirith, and after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Gandalf was the one who led the last debate and came up with the idea to march on the Black Gate and to draw Sauron's armies away from Frodo. The more we delve into the specifics of the War of the Ring and the decades that preceded it, the more we see that Gandalf was pulling the strings behind pretty much everything. There are tons of heroes who contribute to Sauron's eventual downfall, but more or less all of them have Gandalf in their backstories, just as was instructed by Manwë 2,000 years earlier. Gandalf guided the free peoples, and by having his finger in every single pie, he basically pulled off the ultimate win. So, there's my list of 10 facts about the Istari. Make sure you check back next week for my video all about Radagast the Brown, and of course, don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future lore videos or any of my Silmarillion Explained series. And click like and leave a comment and share this video with your friends if you want to. But as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Navaya Melanine.